3 years ago, a lot of ordinary things quietly stopped making sense. A carton of eggs that used to cost $2 suddenly cost 5. Rent jumped hundreds of dollars in a single year. Groceries that once filled an entire cart now barely filled half of it. But the strangest part, most people were still doing the same jobs, earning roughly the same salaries, living in the same apartments. Nothing about their lives had dramatically changed, except the cost of living. And slowly, almost invisibly, a strange question began creeping into everyday conversations. Why does everything feel so expensive now? Not just a little more expensive, but structurally more expensive, in a way that feels permanent. The answer, of course, is inflation. But that word gets thrown around so casually that it almost loses its meaning. Inflation sounds abstract, technical, like something economists argue about on television. In reality, inflation is brutally simple. It's what happens when the price of your life rises faster than your ability to pay for it. And right now, across much of the world, that exact scenario is unfolding. Not because of a single event, but because of a chain reaction that started years ago and is still playing out today. To understand why the cost of living has surged so dramatically, we have to rewind the clock, back to 2020.
When the global economy suddenly stopped. Factories closed. Airplanes stopped flying. Restaurants went dark. Entire industries froze overnight. Governments faced a terrifying possibility, a full economic collapse. So they did something extraordinary. They flooded the system with money. Central banks slashed interest rates to nearly zero. Stimulus checks arrived. Businesses received emergency loans.
Markets were stabilized. At the time, these policies were widely celebrated. They worked. The economy avoided a catastrophic depression. Unemployment dropped faster than expected. Stock markets recovered with shocking speed. It looked like a miracle. But miracles in economics usually come with a bill, and that bill arrived later. Here's the uncomfortable truth about inflation. It doesn't appear instantly. It builds quietly, like pressure inside a sealed container. When central banks inject massive amounts of money into the economy, that money doesn't just sit still, it moves.
Markets were stabilized. At the time, these policies were widely celebrated. They worked. The economy avoided a catastrophic depression. Unemployment dropped faster than expected. Stock markets recovered with shocking speed. It looked like a miracle. But miracles in economics usually come with a bill, and that bill arrived later. Here's the uncomfortable truth about inflation. It doesn't appear instantly. It builds quietly, like pressure inside a sealed container. When central banks inject massive amounts of money into the economy, that money doesn't just sit still. It moves. It flows into markets, into businesses, into assets. For a while, it feels like prosperity. Stock prices rise, housing prices climb, consumers spend more freely. But eventually, the supply of money begins to outpace the supply of actual goods. And when too much money chases too few things, prices rise. That's inflation in its most basic form. But the inflation we're experiencing today is more complicated than that, because it wasn't just money that changed.
The entire global supply system broke down at the same time. For decades, the modern economy depended on something called just-in-time supply chains. It's an elegant idea.
Instead of storing large inventories, companies receive goods exactly when they're needed. Factories order parts days before production. Retailers restock shelves constantly. This system saves money, but it also has a weakness. It works perfectly until something interrupts it. And in 2020, everything interrupted it. Shipping ports clogged with containers. Factories in Asia shut down for months. Truck drivers disappeared from supply networks. Suddenly, the world didn't have enough microchips, or lumber, or used cars, or even basic household products. Demand returned quickly, but supply remained broken, which created the perfect environment for prices to explode. Take cars, for example. In 2019, buying a used car was relatively predictable. Prices were stable. But once microchip shortages began affecting vehicle production, the entire market flipped. New cars became scarce, so buyers rushed into the used car market. Used car prices skyrocketed. At one point, the average used vehicle in the United States increased in price by more than 40%, not because the cars were better, but because there simply weren't enough of them. Now, layer another force on top of that: energy. Energy sits quietly underneath almost every price in the economy. Oil powers transportation. Natural gas heats buildings. Electricity runs factories. When energy prices rise, everything becomes more expensive. And in 2022, global energy markets were shaken by geopolitical conflict. The war in Ukraine disrupted major energy supplies flowing into Europe. Oil markets tightened. Gas prices surged. Utility costs rose.
This didn't just affect drivers at the pump. It rippled through every industry that depended on energy to operate. Food became more expensive. Shipping costs climbed. Manufacturing prices increased. And those higher costs were eventually passed on to consumers. So now, the economy had three powerful inflation engines running at the same time: massive monetary stimulus, broken supply chains, and rising energy prices. Individually, each of these forces can push prices higher. Together, they created something far more powerful: the fastest inflation many developed economies had seen in decades.
But inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. That's one of its most controversial features. If you own assets, inflation can actually benefit you. When prices rise, the value of real estate often rises too. Stocks may climb alongside inflation. Debt becomes easier to repay because the dollars used to pay it back are worth less. In other words, inflation can quietly reward people who already own things. But if most of your income goes toward everyday expenses, inflation feels brutal. Rent rises faster than wages. Groceries eat a larger share of your paycheck. Insurance, healthcare, utilities all climb higher. For millions of households, inflation isn't just an economic statistic. It's a daily stress calculation. What can we cut? What can we delay? What can we no longer afford? And that brings us to the next chapter of this story: central banks fighting back. Once inflation started accelerating, policymakers faced a difficult choice: allow inflation to continue rising or slam the brakes on the economy. They chose the brakes. Interest rates began rising at the fastest pace in decades. The logic is straightforward. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive. Mortgages cost more. Car loans cost more. Credit cards cost more. When borrowing becomes painful, consumers spend less.
Businesses invest less. Demand cools down. And eventually, inflation slows. But this solution comes with a trade-off. Higher interest rates also slow economic growth. Companies hire fewer workers. Housing markets cool. Financial markets become volatile. It's like trying to stop a speeding car without crashing it. Economists even have a name for the ideal outcome: a soft landing, where inflation falls, but the economy avoids a major recession. The problem? Soft landings are rare.
Now, here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because inflation doesn't disappear the moment interest rates rise. Some prices adjust quickly. Gasoline, for example, can fall within weeks, but other prices move slowly. Housing is one of them. Rents often take months or years to adjust. Insurance contracts reset annually. Wages adjust slowly as companies renegotiate salaries. So even when inflation starts declining on paper, the cost of living can still feel painfully high. And this disconnect frustrates people. They hear that inflation is coming down, yet their grocery bills still look shocking.
That's because inflation measures the speed of price increases, not whether prices themselves fall. If inflation drops from 9% to 3%, prices are still rising, just more slowly, which means the cost of living rarely goes backward, it just climbs at a different pace. There's another layer to this story that rarely gets discussed: corporate pricing power. During periods of high inflation, businesses often raise prices to cover rising costs. That's expected. But sometimes companies raise prices more than necessary because inflation creates the perfect cover. Consumers assume everything is getting more expensive anyway, so price increases face less resistance. Some economists refer to this as profit-led inflation. Companies expand margins during inflationary periods. And in certain industries, profit margins did indeed rise during the inflation surge. It's a controversial topic, but it highlights something important. Inflation isn't always just a natural force. It can also be shaped by strategic decisions inside boardrooms. Meanwhile, wages struggle to keep up. For many workers, salary increases arrive once per year, but prices change constantly. If groceries rise 15% this year and your salary rises 4%, your purchasing power just shrank. You're effectively poor, even if your paycheck technically increased. This is why inflation feels so psychologically exhausting. It quietly erodes progress. Savings lose value. Budgets stretch thinner. Long-term financial plans become harder to maintain. And yet, inflation isn't entirely negative. In moderation, it actually helps economies function. A small amount of inflation encourages spending and investment. It discourages people from hoarding cash. It also helps governments manage debt. Most developed economies aim for roughly 2% annual inflation, just enough to keep the system moving. But the inflation surge of recent years went far beyond that target, which forced policymakers into aggressive action.
Now, the world finds itself in a strange transitional moment. Inflation in many countries is falling from its peak, but interest rates remain high. Housing affordability has deteriorated, borrowing is expensive, consumers are cautious, businesses are uncertain. The system is still recalibrating, and the ultimate outcome remains unclear. Because inflation has a long memory, it reshapes expectations. When people experience years of rising prices, their behavior changes. Workers demand higher wages. Businesses plan for higher costs. Landlords expect higher rents. These expectations can make inflation more persistent, even after the original causes fade.
Economists call this inflation psychology, and once it becomes embedded in the system, it can take years to unwind. So where does that leave us? The uncomfortable answer is that the cost of living surge wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was the product of overlapping forces: emergency economic stimulus, supply chain disruptions, energy shocks, corporate pricing strategies, interest rate reactions, and shifting expectations. Each piece of the puzzle amplified the others, and together they reshaped the financial reality of everyday life. Which leads to a final, slightly unsettling question. If the last few years taught us anything,
It's that the economic systems we rely on are more fragile than they appear. A supply shock here, a geopolitical conflict there, a sudden surge of money into the system, and the cost of living can shift dramatically in a very short time. The world adapted to low inflation for nearly 2 decades. It felt normal, stable, predictable. But now that era looks less certain. Because once societies become familiar with higher inflation, it raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the rising cost of living we're experiencing right now isn't a temporary crisis at all? What if it's the beginning of a new economic baseline? And if that's true, then the real question isn't just how inflation started. The real question is whether the systems designed to control it still work the way we think they do.